The crystal tumbler shattered against the wall, bourbon dripping down the custom silk wallpaper like tears. "Get out," Thaddeus Westbrook hissed, his voice dangerously quiet. "And take your resignation letter with you." The young woman, the 11th nanny in 3 years, clutched her designer handbag to her chest, chin trembling as she backed toward the door. "Those children need their father, Mr. Westbrook, not another replacement caretaker." Thad turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Greenwich estate, silhouetted against the stormy Connecticut sky. "My assistant will process your final payment. Double the agreed amount if you're gone in the next 5 minutes." When the door clicked shut, he pressed his forehead against the cool glass. 3 years. 1,095 days since Vivian had slipped away, her last breath given to bring their twins into the world. His phone vibrated. Cordelia. His sister never called unless it was urgent. He declined the call. The house's security system chimed, announcing his assistant's arrival. Seconds later, a sharp knock preceded Monica Chen's entrance. She'd been with him through the rise of Westbrook Technologies, through Vivian's death, through his subsequent transformation into whatever hollow thing he'd become. "Your sister is on her way," Monica said, already typing on her tablet. She overrode security protocols. Of course she did. "The board meeting is in 3 hours. The Jensen acquisition papers need your signature." She paused, and the children's pediatrician called. "Finn's asthma medication needs." "Handle it." Thad cut her off. "Whatever it costs." "Why are we discussing this?" "Because you fired their doctor last month for suggesting family therapy, and the new one refuses to prescribe without speaking to you directly." Thad closed his eyes, feeling the familiar migraine building. "Make it happen, Monica. That's what I pay you for." The study door burst open. Cordelia Westbrook haze swept in, designer raincoat dripping on the hardwood floors. At 34, for years his junior, she remained the only person who dared confront him directly. "Nanny number 11 just called me crying from her car," Cordelia said, throwing her wet coat over a leather chair. "You're a real piece of work, Thad." "I don't have time for this," he muttered, reaching for the bourbon decanter. Cordelia intercepted, gripping his wrist. "It's 11 in the morning. It's 5 o'clock somewhere," he replied automatically. "Your children don't know you. Do you realize that?" Her eyes, the same piercing blue as his, narrowed. "Finn asked me last week if you were just someone who lived in their house." The words landed like physical blows, but Thad maintained his mask of indifference. "I provide for them. They want for nothing. Except their father." Cordelia released his wrist. "I found someone. Another nanny candidate? Pass. This one's different. She has a master's in child psychology, specialized in grief counseling for young children." Thad laughed, the sound hollow. "You think my children need grief counseling? They never knew their mother. But they're living with her ghost every day," Cordelia shot back. "This woman comes highly recommended by Dr. Levinson. Just meet her." "No." "Fine. Then I'm calling social services." Thad's head snapped up. "You wouldn't dare." "Watch me." Cordelia crossed her arms. "When's the last time you spent more than 5 minutes with them? Do you even know which one has the stuffed elephant and which one has the penguin?" The silence stretched between them. "Her name is Aloan Blackwood," Cordelia finally said, voice softer. "She's coming tomorrow at 10. Be there, or I swear to God." "Thad, I'll make that call." After Cordelia left, Thad moved to his desk, pressing the intercom. "Monica, clear my morning schedule tomorrow." He reached for the framed photo he kept face down. Vivian, radiant at 7 months pregnant, laughing as she rested her hands on her swollen belly. He'd taken the picture himself, one of their last happy moments. Upstairs, small footsteps pattered across the hallway, the twins being led to their playroom by the household staff. Their laughter, muffled by distance and closed doors, reached him like echoes from another life. Thad replaced the frame face down and opened his laptop. Tomorrow, he would meet this Aloan Blackwood and send her away like all the others. The children were safer that way, safer from the poison of his grief, from the man he'd become. The bourbon bottle beckoned, but instead, he buried himself in acquisition reports, letting the numbers numb him better than alcohol ever could. Aloan Blackwood gripped her umbrella against the autumn wind as she approached the imposing iron gates of the Westbrook estate. Rain lashed her face while the security guard verified her appointment. Her resume, safely tucked in her waterproof messenger bag, contained no lies, just strategic omissions. The intercom crackled. Drive up to the main entrance, Miss Blackwood. The gates swung open, revealing a winding driveway flanked by immaculate gardens. Eloan's 15-year-old Honda Civic looked comically out of place as she parked beside a row of luxury vehicles. Deep breath, she whispered to herself. You're just here for the children. A tall Asian woman in a tailored suit greeted her at the door. Monica Chun, Mr. Westbrook's executive assistant. Follow me. The mansion's interior was a study in modern luxury. All clean lines, contemporary art, and subtle displays of wealth. Yet something felt hollow, as though the space had been designed for a magazine spread rather than a family. Mr. Westbrook is running late. I'll conduct the preliminary interview, Monica explained, leading her to a sunlit sitting room. You'll be the 12th nanny we've interviewed this year. What happened to the others? Eloan asked, setting down her bag. Monica's expression remained professionally neutral. Let's discuss your qualifications first. For 20 minutes, Eloan outlined her experience, her approach to childhood trauma, and her educational background. Monica took notes on her tablet, occasionally nodding. The twins are 3 years old, Monica finally said. Finn has mild asthma. Phoebe is developing normally, but rarely speaks to strangers. Both children have limited interaction with their father. Due to his work schedule? Eloan ventured. Due to his preference, Monica replied flatly. The position includes a private suite in the East Wing, full benefits, and a salary that's generous. In return, we expect absolute discretion and flexibility. A door opened, and a statuesque woman entered. I'm Cordelia, Thad's sister, she announced, extending her hand. Has my brother bothered to show up yet? He's on a call with Tokyo, Monica replied. Of course he is. Cordelia turned to Eloan. Why don't we introduce you to the children while we wait? They ascended a sweeping staircase to the second floor. The nursery wing was painted in cheerful colors that contrasted sharply with the rest of the home's monochrome palette. A young woman looked up from where she sat between two dark-haired toddlers. This is Lucia, their temporary caretaker, Cordelia explained. The twins regarded Eloan with identical pairs of wary blue eyes. Vivian's eyes, though Eloan kept this recognition to herself. Hello, she said, kneeling to their level. I'm Ellie. Finn clutched a stuffed elephant closer. Phoebe hid partially behind her brother. Eloan reached into her bag and pulled out 2 small, handmade sock puppets. These are my friends. They're a bit shy too. The simple puppets, a cat and a dog, caught the children's attention. Eloan made the cat puppet whisper something to her. Oh, Mr. Whiskers wants to know if you like stories. Finn nodded hesitantly. Me too. Eloan smiled. Maybe we could read one together? Phoebe emerged slightly from behind her brother, pointing to a bookshelf. Excellent choice, Eloan said, reaching for the book Phoebe indicated. She began reading, giving each character a distinct voice. Within minutes, both children had inched closer. Cordelia exchanged glances with Monica. The door opened abruptly. Thaddeus Westbrook filled the frame, his imposing 6'2" frame in a tailored charcoal suit. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jawline carried 3 days' worth of stubble. The twins froze. Daddy, Finn whispered, his voice holding neither excitement nor fear, just uncertainty. Thad's gaze traveled from his children to Eloan. Miss Blackwood, I presume? Yes, she replied, rising to her feet. We were just getting acquainted. In my children's nursery? Without my permission. His tone was glacial. I invited her, Cordelia interjected. Since you were unavailable. Again, Thad's eyes, a darker blue than his children's, assessed Eloan with clinical detachment. My office. Now. Cordelia squeezed Eloan's shoulder reassuringly before Eloan followed Thad downstairs. His office was precisely what she'd expected. Minimalist, expensive, and dominated by technology. Your resume is impressive, he said, not bothering to sit or invite her to do so. But I notice you've changed career paths recently. What? The question was a trap. Eloan maintained eye contact. I believe children facing trauma require specialized support. My research in developmental psychology showed me I could make a greater impact through direct intervention rather than academic study. And the Westbrook household represents a research opportunity? His voice was dangerously soft. No, it represents 2 children who deserve stability. A muscle in his jaw tightened. You know nothing about my children. I know they recognized the book Phoebe selected because the spine was well worn, suggesting they find comfort in familiar stories. I know Finn positions himself as a protector for his sister, and I know they both flinched when you entered the room. Silence stretched between them. You're hired, he said abruptly. Monica will handle the paperwork. You start tomorrow. Aloan blinked. Just like that. Just like that. But understand this. He stepped closer. If you hurt my children in any way, your fancy degree won't protect you. The threat hung in the air as he walked past her toward the door. Mr. Westbrook, she called after him. He paused without turning. They need their father more than they need me. His shoulders tensed, but he continued out the door without responding. Later, driving home to her small apartment, Aloan's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Phase 1 complete. She was inside the Westbrook mansion. The real challenge would be keeping her own dark secrets buried while excavating his. 6 weeks into her position at the Westbrook mansion, Aloan stared at the ceiling of her suite, sleepless at 2 a.m. The transition had been smoother than anticipated. The twins had warmed to her quickly, their small hands seeking hers, their voices growing more animated each day. But their father remained a ghost in his own home. Her phone buzzed with a text. It was her brother, Grant. Any progress? She typed back. Not yet. Be patient. Dad's lawyer called again. Time's running out. Aloan set the phone face down. The weight of her dual mission pressed against her chest. Care for these innocent children while gathering evidence that their father had destroyed hers. A soft cry from down the hall interrupted her thoughts. Phoebe's nightmares had returned. Aloan slipped on a robe and hurried to the nursery. To her surprise, Thaddeus was already there, awkwardly perched on Phoebe's small bed, his large hand patting her back stiffly. It's okay, he was saying, his voice uncertain. Daddy's here. Phoebe continued sobbing, unconsoled. May I? Aloan asked from the doorway. Thad's head snapped up, embarrassment flashing across his features before the familiar mask of indifference returned. He nodded once and stood. Aloan sat beside Phoebe, gathering the child into her arms, humming a gentle melody. The monsters can't get you, she whispered. Remember our special shield? Let's build it together. Phoebe's breathing gradually slowed as they went through their ritual of imagining a protective bubble around her bed. Finn, awakened by the commotion, padded over from his adjacent bed and crawled in next to his sister. Can Daddy stay too? Finn asked, his voice small. Aloan looked up at Thad, who stood frozen by the window. I have work, he said automatically. At 2 a.m? Aloan challenged quietly. Something shifted in his expression. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled up a chair beside the bed. One story, he conceded. Finn's face lit up. The boat one. Thad looked panicked. I don't. The blue book on the shelf, Aloan supplied. Third from the left. He retrieved it, settling back into the chair with obvious discomfort. His deep voice stumbled over the words at first, then gradually found its rhythm. By the story's end, both children were drifting back to sleep, Finn's small hand reaching out to rest on his father's knee. In the hallway outside the nursery, Thad ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Thank you, he said stiffly. They need more moments like that, Aloan replied. I'm not good at this. No one is at first. But they don't need perfection, they need presence. His eyes met hers, something unguarded flickering there. Monica mentioned you've implemented a new routine for them. Yes. Structure helps children process grief, even when they're too young to name it. A shadow crossed his face. They don't remember her. They remember the absence, Aloan said gently. And they see her loss reflected in you every day. His jaw tightened. You overstep, Miss Blackwood. That's what you pay me for. She held his gaze. Join us for breakfast tomorrow. 7:30. They ask for you every morning. She expected refusal. Instead, he gave a curt nod before retreating down the hallway. The next morning, to everyone's surprise, Thad appeared at 7:25, wearing casual clothes instead of his usual suit. The twins froze mid-bite, uncertain how to react to this anomaly. Daddy's going to have breakfast with us today, Aloan announced cheerfully, placing a coffee mug at the head of the table. I have meetings at 9, he said, as if justifying his presence. Plenty of time for pancakes, then. Over the following weeks, breakfast became a tentative routine. At first, conversation was stilted, with Aloan bridging the awkward silences. Gradually, Thad began asking questions about the children's activities, even occasionally arriving home early enough for dinner. On a crisp October afternoon, Eloan took the twins to the estate's sprawling gardens. She looked up to see Thad watching from his office window. Impulsively, she waved him down. After a visible internal debate, he emerged onto the terrace. "We're hunting for red leaves," Finn announced, holding up his collection. "I've been informed it's a scientific expedition," Eloan explained, smiling. Something rare happened. Thad's lips curved into a small smile. "I used to collect rocks at their age." "Show us," Phoebe demanded, grabbing his hand. For a moment, Thad seemed ready to pull away, but then he allowed his daughter to drag him toward a maple tree. Eloan watched as he lifted Phoebe onto his shoulders to reach a particularly vibrant leaf. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eloan was organizing their art supplies when Thad appeared in the doorway. "She spoke to me," he said, his voice hushed with wonder. "Phoebe asked me to read to her tonight. Not Finn asking for her. She asked me directly." "That's progress," Eloan replied, warmth spreading through her chest. "Because of you." His admission came reluctantly. "Monica's prepared your performance review. Your bonus will reflect our satisfaction." "I don't need a bonus, Mr. Westbrook. I need you to keep showing up." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. For a breathless moment, Eloan thought he might say more, might finally begin to open up. The doorbell shattered the moment. "Thad," a booming voice called from downstairs. "Where are you hiding, you magnificent bastard?" Thad's expression hardened instantly. "Mercer Wellington, my former business partner," he explained tersely. "I wasn't expecting him." Eloan's blood ran cold. Mercer Wellington, the man whose name appeared throughout her father's papers, the potential missing link in her investigation. "Come," Thad said. "You should meet him." As they descended the stairs, Eloan fought to keep her expression neutral. Her worlds were colliding much sooner than she'd planned. Mercer Wellington stood in the foyer, charismatic and sharp-eyed at 50. His gaze locked on Eloan immediately, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Well, well," he said, "what have we here?" "Eloan Blackwood, the twins' nanny," Thad introduced her. Mercer took her hand, holding it longer than necessary. "Blackwood," he repeated, studying her face intently. "Why does that name sound familiar?" "It's quite common," she replied smoothly, withdrawing her hand. "I never forget a face," Mercer insisted. "Have we met before?" "I don't believe so." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Perhaps I'm mistaken." But the calculating look that remained told Eloan he was far from convinced. The careful life she had constructed at the Westbrook estate suddenly felt like a house of cards in a rising wind. "You seem distracted," Thad observed as he poured himself a scotch. 3 weeks had passed since Mercer's unexpected visit, and the autumn rain lashed against the library windows with growing intensity. Eloan looked up from the children's schedule she'd been reviewing. "Just finalizing next week's activities." "At 11 o'clock at night?" She closed her laptop. "I could ask why you're still working." A hint of amusement crossed his face. These moments came more frequently now. "Touché." Thunder rumbled in the distance. In the 3 months since she'd arrived, subtle shifts had transformed the household. The twins were flourishing, speaking more, laughing often. And Thad was slowly emerging from his self-imposed exile, though he maintained careful boundaries. "The board approved the children's wing at the hospital," he said suddenly. "Your suggestion about pediatric grief counseling resonated with them. That's wonderful. It will help many families." He studied her over the rim of his glass. "You never talk about yourself." "There's not much to tell. Your resume lists Brentwood, Massachusetts as your hometown, yet you pronounce certain words with a slight Pacific Northwest inflection." Eloan tensed. "You've been investigating me?" "I investigate everyone who comes near my children." His eyes, sharp and perceptive, held hers. "Your graduate thesis on childhood trauma was published under Eloan Carlyle." Her heart thundered against her ribs. "Blackwood is my mother's maiden name. I took it after my parents divorced. Yet your emergency contact is Grant Blackwood, listed as your brother." "Half-brother," she corrected, the lie sliding out with practiced ease. Before he could press further, the library lights flickered and died. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. "Power outage," Thad said unnecessarily. "The generator should kick in momentarily." When it didn't, he sighed and stood. "Wait here." Left alone, Eloan released a shaky breath. She needed to be more careful. Thad was more observant than she'd anticipated, and Mercer's unexpected appearance had thrown her timeline into disarray. Her phone vibrated with a text from Grant. "The trustees are getting nervous. We need something concrete." Thad returned with an armful of candles and a flashlight. "Generators malfunctioning. Maintenance can't get here until morning." He arranged the candles around the library, their warm glow creating islands of light in the darkness. "The children," Eloan began. "I checked. Sound asleep." He hesitated. "I also set up the baby monitor from when they were infants. Just in case." The simple act of parental concern made something twist inside her chest. This wasn't the cold, calculating man her father had described in his journals. This was someone broken, trying to reassemble himself for his children's sake. "You're good with them," he said quietly, refilling his glass. "Better than I deserve. They're incredible children. Smart, resilient. Like their mother." Pain flashed across his features. Vivian would have known how to reach them from the beginning. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife by name to Eloan. "Tell me about her," she said softly. Silence stretched between them, punctuated by thunder. Finally, he spoke. "She loved thunderstorms. Said they cleared the air, made everything feel new again." He stared into his glass. "We met at Columbia. She was studying art history. I was already launching my first company. She saw past all of it, the ambition, the drive. She saw me." Eloan remained silent, afraid any comment would break the spell. "When the doctors told us it was twins, she was ecstatic." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She painted their nursery herself, refusing to let decorators near it. She was 7 months pregnant, balanced on a ladder with a paintbrush, when I came home early one day." The tenderness in his voice made Eloan's planned mission suddenly feel sordid. "Her pregnancy became high risk in the 3rd trimester," he continued, his voice hollowing. "The specialists warned us, but she refused selective reduction. She said she could feel them both, their distinct personalities already forming." He drained his glass. "She started hemorrhaging during delivery. I was holding Finn when they called the code. I never even got to introduce her to her son." "I'm so sorry," Eloan whispered. "My father died 6 months earlier, heart attack brought on by stress after we lost everything." His jaw tightened. Vivian was my anchor through that nightmare. Then suddenly, she was gone too. Guilt clawed at Eloan's throat. Her father, Silas Blackwood, had been implicated in the corporate espionage that destroyed Westbrook's first company. According to the records she'd found after his death, Thad's father had committed suicide shortly after the scandal broke. But her father's journals told a different story, of being framed, of Thad Westbrook orchestrating his destruction out of revenge for an earlier business dispute. Now, seeing the raw pain etched on Thad's face, doubt crept in. "What happened to your first company?" she asked carefully. His expression closed. "Corporate sabotage. Trade secrets stolen, shared with competitors." He set down his glass. "But that's ancient history. Is that why you distance yourself from the children?" "Fear of more loss." Lightning illuminated his face, revealing a flash of vulnerability before darkness reclaimed it. "You have an annoying habit of asking precisely the questions I don't want to answer." "It's a professional skill," she replied, attempting to lighten the mood. "What about you?" he countered. "What secrets are you running from, Eloan Blackwood? Or is it Carlyle? We all have chapters we don't read aloud." Something shifted in his gaze. He moved closer, the candlelight casting shadows across his face. "Why do I feel like you're reading mine?" Her pulse quickened. "Perhaps because you've kept them closed for too long." For a breathless moment, the air between them seemed charged with more than the storm's electricity. Thad reached out, his fingers lightly brushing a strand of hair from her face. The overhead lights suddenly blazed, shattering the intimate tableau. They both blinked in the harsh fluorescence, stepping away from each other. "Power's back," he said unnecessarily, his professional mask sliding back into place. "It's late. You should get some rest." Eloan nodded, gathering her laptop. At the door, she paused. "Thad." He looked up, startled by her use of his first name. "Thank you for sharing about Vivian. The twins would love to hear those stories someday." Something unreadable crossed his face. "Good night, Ms. Blackwood." Alone in her suite, Eloan opened her laptop and stared at the folder labeled Blackwood versus Westbrook. The documentation seemed damning. Financial records, cryptic emails, the timeline of her father's downfall. But now, uncertainty gnawed at her. What if her father's account wasn't the full truth? What if Mercer Wellington played a larger role than either man had known? Her phone rang, Mercer's name flashing on the screen. She'd given him her number reluctantly when he'd insisted on discussing a children's charity event. "It's nearly midnight, Mr. Wellington." "Yet you answered," he replied smoothly. "Have dinner with me tomorrow. There's a matter I'd like to discuss privately." "Regarding the charity gala?" "Regarding your true identity, Miss Blackwood. Or should I say, Miss Blackwood Carlyle?" Ice flooded her veins. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." His voice hardened. "Dinner. Tomorrow. 7 o'clock. I'll text you the address." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer I share my discoveries with Thad directly?" The line went dead, leaving Aloan staring at her phone in horror. Her carefully constructed world was unraveling faster than she could mend it. And worst of all, she could no longer be certain whose version of the truth she was fighting for. The Westbrook Foundation's annual charity gala transformed the mansion's grand ballroom into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over Manhattan's elite as they sipped champagne and wrote generous checks for pediatric cancer research, a cause Vivian had championed before her death. Aloan adjusted the simple black gown Monica had selected for her. "I'm not sure I should be here," she whispered to Cordelia. "This is a family event." "You are practically family now," Cordelia replied, surveying the room. "Besides," the twins insisted, "they've never wanted to attend before." Across the ballroom, Thad stood surrounded by board members, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo despite wearing it with innate grace. The twins clung to his legs, Finn in a miniature suit and Phoebe in a blue dress that matched her eyes. The dinner with Mercer 3 nights ago replayed in Aloan's mind. His office had been a shrine to his accomplishments, photos with politicians, celebrities, and business titans. Between perfectly cooked steaks and expensive wine, he'd laid out what he knew. Silas Blackwood's daughter, he'd said, studying her reaction. Working in Thad's home under false pretenses. "I'm curious about your endgame." She denied everything, of course, but Mercer wasn't fooled. "I knew your father well," he continued. "Brilliant man. Tragic end." His eyes had hardened. "Whatever you think you know about what happened between Silas and Thad, you're missing crucial pieces. Such as who really orchestrated your father's downfall." He'd leaned closer. "Information has value, Aloan. I could help you, for the right arrangement." The conversation had ended in a stalemate. Mercer agreed to temporary silence in exchange for future consideration. She'd left feeling unclean, uncertain, and increasingly convinced that the truth was more complex than her father's journal suggested. "Earth to Ellie." Cordelia's voice pulled her back to the present. "My brother's waving you over." Thad's expression softened imperceptibly as she approached. Over the past months, these micro-expressions had become a language she could read. The slight lift at the corner of his mouth when pleased, the minuscule furrow between his brows when concerned. "Ms. Blackwood," he greeted formally, mindful of their audience. "The children were asking for you." Phoebe immediately reached for her hand. "Dance," she demanded, her small voice resolute. "The band's setting up, sweetheart," Thad explained. "I promised to save my first dance for Princess Phoebe," Aloan said, curtsying dramatically to the little girl, who giggled in response. Finn tugged at his father's jacket. "You dance too, Daddy." Thad looked trapped. "I don't really. I told them about how you and Vivian met at a charity dance." Cordelia interjected with sisterly mischief. "They've been obsessed with the idea ever since." Something flickered in Thad's eyes, a memory, perhaps, of happier times. The string quartet began playing, and several couples moved to the dance floor. Aloan swung Phoebe in gentle circles while the little girl stood on her shoes. Across the floor, Thad awkwardly held Finn's hands as they shuffled together. "Mr. Westbrook, you danced divinely," came a silky voice as Mercer Wellington appeared beside them. "Though I believe proper ballroom requires partners closer to one's own height." He turned to Aloan, his smile predatory. "Miss Blackwood, would you do me the honor? I believe the children should see their father dance with a suitable partner." Before she could refuse, Mercer had smoothly transferred Phoebe to a nearby Cordelia and gestured expectantly toward Thad. For a moment, Aloan thought Thad would decline, but to her surprise, he nodded. "One dance," he said, extending his hand to her. His palm was warm against hers as he led her to the center of the floor. When his arm slipped around her waist, maintaining a respectable distance, her breath caught. "You don't have to do this," she murmured as they began moving to the waltz. "Phoebe is watching," he replied simply. "She needs to see that not all touch is to be feared." They moved together with unexpected ease, as though their bodies recognized a rhythm their minds had yet to acknowledge. "You've been avoiding me since the night of the storm," he said quietly. "I've been busy with the children." "Liar," he replied, but without malice. Something changed that night. Eloan couldn't meet his eyes. Nothing changed. We simply revealed more than intended. His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "You've been meeting with Mercer." Her head snapped up. "How did you?" "I make it my business to know where my children's caretaker goes." "You had me followed?" "Security protocol," he said unapologetically. "Why Mercer?" She struggled to maintain composure. "He's on the charity committee. We discussed tonight's event." Another lie. His eyes, intensely blue under the chandelier lights, held hers. "What game are you playing, Eloan?" The music swelled around them, and for a horrifying moment, she considered telling him everything. Her father's journals, the evidence she'd been gathering, her growing doubts. "No game," she managed. "Just trying to do my job." "Your job doesn't include private dinners with my former business partner." "Are you jealous, Mr. Westbrook?" The words escaped before she could stop them. His step faltered momentarily, genuine surprise crossing his features. Then something else replaced it, a heat that made her pulse quicken. "What if I were?" he asked, voice dropping lower. The rest of the room seemed to fade away as they moved together. The careful walls they'd constructed between employer and employee, between past enemies, between broken souls, were crumbling with each beat of the music. "It would be inappropriate," she whispered, even as she found herself drawn closer to him. "Entirely," he agreed, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips. The music ended, leaving them standing too close in the center of the dance floor. Applause broke the spell, and they stepped apart. Eloan's cheeks burned as she felt curious eyes upon them. "I should check on the children," she said, needing escape. Thad nodded, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Of course." She made her way to where Cordelia sat with the twins, now sleepy despite the excitement. Phoebe crawled immediately into her lap. "Well," Cordelia said with a knowing smile. "That was unexpected." "It was just a dance," Eloan replied, smoothing Phoebe's hair. "Tell that to the 50 gossip columnists in the room." Before Eloan could respond, a commotion erupted near the bar. Mercer Wellington, clearly intoxicated, was engaged in a heated conversation with one of the board members. "He gets like this at every event," Cordelia sighed. "Thad will handle it." Sure enough, Thad was already steering Mercer away from the crowd, his expression thunderous. They disappeared into the library adjacent to the ballroom. "I should take the children upstairs," Eloan said, gathering a drooping fin into her arms. She had just tucked both twins into their beds when raised voices echoed from downstairs. Most guests had departed, leaving only close friends and family. "You're a fraud." Mercer's voice carried clearly. "A goddamn fraud." Concerned, Eloan hurried toward the library. The doors stood partially open, revealing Thad and Mercer in confrontation. "You're drunk, Mercer," Thad was saying coldly. "Go home before you embarrass yourself further. Why don't we ask your lovely nanny what she thinks?" Mercer slurred, turning toward the door. "Ah, perfect timing." Thad's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "Miss Blackwood, this doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," Mercer laughed bitterly. "Tell him who you really are. Tell him why you're really here." Eloan froze as Thad's gaze sharpened. "What is he talking about?" "Don't know," Mercer continued, circling her like a shark. "Meet Eloan Blackwood Carlyle, daughter of Silas Blackwood, the man you destroyed." Blood drained from Eloan's face as Thad went completely still. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I can explain. She's been investigating you," Mercer cut in. "Digging for dirt, evidence that you framed her daddy. Probably planning a lawsuit, or maybe just good old-fashioned revenge." The betrayal that flooded Thad's expression cut deeper than Eloan had anticipated. Whatever fragile connection had formed between them shattered visibly. "Get out," he said, each word precise and glacial. "Pack your things and be gone within the hour." "Thad, please, the children." "Don't," he snapped. "Don't you dare use my children as leverage. They've already lost one mother figure. They'll survive losing another." The cruelty of his words was calculated to wound, and it succeeded. Aloan felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Mercer watched their exchange with thinly veiled satisfaction. I tried to warn you, Thad. Some people can't be trusted. Thad didn't acknowledge him, his focus remaining on Aloan. You've had access to my home, my children, my life, all under false pretenses. Not everything was false, she whispered. Something flashed in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or merely anger. Monica will process your final payment. Never contact my family again. He brushed past her, leaving her alone with Mercer, who approached with a triumphant smile. Don't look so devastated, he said softly. I did warn you. Now you and I can discuss a more mutually beneficial arrangement. Aloan stepped away from his reaching hand. You planned this all along. His smile widened. Welcome to the real world, my dear. Now, shall we discuss terms? There's nothing to discuss. She straightened her spine. You've won. I'm leaving. As she turned to go, Mercer caught her arm. Don't be foolish. I have information about what really happened to your father. Information worth millions. She pulled free. And what would it cost me? His eyes traveled down her body. We can negotiate. Disgust rose in her throat. No, thank you. I'll find the truth my own way. His expression hardened. You're making a serious mistake. Not my first, she replied, thinking of the moment she'd accepted this position, of the lines she'd crossed, of the hearts, including her own, that she'd broken in pursuit of a truth she no longer recognized. Upstairs, she paused outside the twins' room, her hand on the doorknob. Inside, she could hear Thad's voice, low and soothing, explaining in terms a 3-year-old might understand that Miss Ellie had to go away. Phoebe's wail of distress pierced Aloan's heart like a physical wound. I'm sorry, she whispered to the closed door. I'm so sorry. 30 minutes later, she walked out of the Westbrook mansion with a single suitcase, leaving behind children she'd grown to love and a man she. 3 weeks after leaving the Westbrook mansion, Aloan stared at the rain-streaked window of her studio apartment. Outside, New York City continued its relentless pace, indifferent to her personal apocalypse. Her phone displayed 6 missed calls from Grant and a text from Cordelia that she couldn't bring herself to open. The twins' 4th birthday had passed 2 days ago. She'd stood outside a toy store for an hour, clutching wrapped presents she knew she could never deliver. A knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Grant, his expression grim. You look terrible, he said, stepping inside without invitation. Thanks. She closed the door behind him. What are you doing here? You've been ignoring my calls. He surveyed the apartment. Takeout containers, research papers, and her father's journals spread across every surface. Jesus, L. What happened to you? Mercer Wellington happened. He exposed me to Thad. Grant dropped onto her sofa. So that's it. You're giving up. I was wrong, Grant. She sank into the chair opposite him. I don't think Thad destroyed Dad. Not intentionally. You're defending him now? After what he did to our family. Aloan pressed her fingers to her temples. I've been reviewing Dad's journals, cross-referencing them with the financial records. The timeline doesn't add up. There are inconsistencies, meetings Dad mentioned that aren't in his calendar. So he was disorganized. That doesn't change the facts. What if the facts we've been given aren't accurate? She grabbed a folder from the coffee table. Look at this. 3 payments from offshore accounts to Dad's private bank in the Caymans, just before everything collapsed. Dad never mentioned these. Grant snatched the papers. Where did you get these? I've been digging deeper. And I found something else. She pulled out her laptop. Emails between Dad and Mercer Wellington, discussing a contingency plan if something called Project Lazarus failed. What does that mean? I don't know yet. But Mercer's involvement runs deeper than either Dad or Thad realized. Grant studied her face. You care about him, don't you? Westbrook. She looked away. This isn't about my feelings. It's about the truth. The truth is he destroyed our father. Dad lost everything because of him. I'm not sure that's the whole story anymore. Grant stood abruptly. The trustees are losing patience. If we don't file the lawsuit by the end of the month, they'll replace me as executor. We need more time. We don't have it. He grabbed his coat. I've scheduled a meeting with the lawyers tomorrow. I expect you to be there. After he left, Aloan returned to her research with renewed determination. Something about Mercer's smugness, his eagerness to drive a wedge between her and Thad, felt calculated. If he truly wanted leverage over her, why expose her so publicly? Her Her phone chimed with a notification. An email from an anonymous account contained only an address in Brooklyn and the message regarding S. Blackwood and M. Wellington. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Normally, she'd dismiss it as a trap, but desperation made her reckless. She needed answers before Grant moved forward with the lawsuit. The next day, she skipped the meeting with the lawyers and took a taxi to the address, a rundown warehouse converted to artist studios. A security guard directed her to the third floor. The studio was filled with abstract sculptures of twisted metal. A woman in her 60s, silver hair cropped close to her scalp, stood beside a workbench. Loretta Weiss. Aloan asked cautiously. The woman nodded. You look like him. Same eyes. You knew my father? I was Silas Blackwood's executive assistant for 15 years. She gestured to a worn sofa, including during his final days at Blackwood Technologies. You sent the email? I've been following the news. Rumors of a lawsuit against Thaddeus Westbrook. Loretta wiped her hands on a rag. Before you destroy another man's life, you should know what really happened. Aloan sat, heart pounding. I'm listening. Your father was brilliant but flawed. When his company began struggling against Westbrook's innovations, he made desperate choices. Loretta pulled a flash drive from her pocket, including partnering with Mercer Wellington. Mercer worked with Thad, not my father. Officially, yes. Unofficially, Mercer played both sides. He provided Silas with insider information while simultaneously convincing Thad that Silas was stealing trade secrets. Why would Mercer do that? Money. Power. He positioned himself to pick up the pieces when both companies collapsed. Loretta handed Aloan the flash drive. This contains communications between them, messages your father thought he'd deleted. Aloan stared at the small device. Why are you giving me this now? Because I loved your father, despite his flaws. And I don't want to see his daughter destroy herself pursuing misguided vengeance. Loretta's eyes softened. He wasn't murdered, Aloan. He took his own life when he realized what Mercer had done, turned him into exactly what he despised. Across town, Thaddeus Westbrook sat in his home office, staring at the twins' birthday photos without seeing them. The house had reverted to its former silence since Aloan's departure. The twins had withdrawn, Phoebe retreating into selective mutism again, Finn becoming increasingly defiant. The succession of temporary nannies had all quit within days, unable to manage the children's emotional regression. Even Monica had expressed concern about his own return to isolation. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Cordelia entered without waiting for permission, a habit from childhood she'd never outgrown. You look worse than she does, his sister observed. Who? Don't play dumb. It doesn't suit you. Cordelia perched on his desk. I visited Aloan yesterday. Thad's jaw tightened. Her name is banned from this house. Grow up, Thad. She made a mistake. A big one, granted, but are you really going to punish the twins for it? She lied to me, used my children to get close to me. And yet, those 3 months were the happiest this household has been since Vivian died. Cordelia softened her tone. The twins miss her. You miss her. That's irrelevant. Is it? Because the board called me. You've missed 3 meetings, canceled the Jensen acquisition, and apparently spent 2 hours yesterday staring at the wall during a key investor presentation. Thad stood abruptly. I don't need relationship advice from my little sister. Apparently you do, since you're being an idiot. She's Silas Blackwood's daughter, the man who destroyed our father's company, who according to public record was never convicted of anything. Cordelia crossed her arms. Have you even asked for her side of the story? I don't need to hear more lies. God, you're stubborn. She sighed dramatically. Fine, wallow in your misery, but don't punish those children by checking out again. After Cordelia left, Thad found himself wandering to the nursery. The twins were napping, their small faces troubled even in sleep. Finn clutched the stuffed elephant Aloan had given him for his birthday, delivered by mail since Thad had forbidden her from seeing them. He sank into the reading chair where she had spent countless hours with stories and puppet shows. Despite his anger, he couldn't deny the positive changes she'd brought to their lives, or the emptiness her absence had created. His phone vibrated with an incoming call from Mercer. He declined it, as he had dozens of times since the gala. Whatever business proposal Mercer wanted to discuss could wait indefinitely. Later that evening, as Thad attempted to settle the twins for bed, a ritual that had become a nightly battle, Finn asked the question Thad had been dreading. Why did Ellie leave? Did we make her sad? Thad sat on the edge of the bed, searching for words a 4-year-old could understand. No, buddy. It wasn't your fault. Was it your fault? Phoebe asked, breaking her weeks-long silence. The unexpected question stunned him. Why would you think that? You were dancing, she said simply. Then you were yelling. Then she was gone. Children saw more than adults gave them credit for. Thad struggled with how to explain adult complexities to these innocent minds. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that are hard to fix, he said finally. Did you try? Finn pressed. When I fight with Phoebe, you make us say sorry. Out of the mouths of babes. Thad had never even given Aloan a chance to explain, had he? His pride and pain had overridden rational thought, just as they had after Vivian's death. No, he admitted quietly. I didn't try. Try now, Phoebe urged, her blue eyes, Vivian's eyes, regarding him solemnly. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Why? The fundamental question children asked that adults struggled to answer honestly. Why indeed? Because he was afraid. Afraid of being vulnerable again. Afraid of being betrayed again. Afraid of the feelings that had begun to develop for a woman he now knew had entered his life under false pretenses. But also afraid that she'd been genuine in ways that mattered most. Her care for his children, her gradual dismantling of his defensive walls, the connection that had sparked between them during their dance. I'll think about it, he promised, kissing their foreheads. After they finally fell asleep, Thad retreated to his study and poured himself a scotch. On impulse, he opened his laptop and typed Silas Blackwood into the search bar. Hours later, he sat back, mind reeling from what he'd discovered. Silas had died in an apparent suicide 6 months after the corporate espionage scandal, leaving behind 2 children and a mountain of debt. The similarities to his own father's fate were unsettling. Most disturbing were the financial records showing significant transactions between Mercer's private holding company and Blackwood Technologies in the weeks before the scandal broke. Transactions Thad had never known about. Had he been wrong all these years? Had Mercer manipulated them both? His phone rang again. Mercer, persistent as always. This time, Thad answered. We need to talk, he said without preamble. Tomorrow. My office. Finally, Mercer sounded relieved. I've been trying to reach you about this investment opportunity that, this isn't about business, Thad cut him off. It's about Silas Blackwood. A pause. Ancient history, Thad. Why dredge that up now? Noon tomorrow. Be there. Thad ended the call, a cold certainty settling in his chest. Whatever the truth was, he would find it. He owed that much to his children, to himself, and perhaps to Aloan as well. The mountain cabin had belonged to Aloan's father, a retreat where Silas Blackwood had spent his final days assembling the evidence that might have cleared his name. Now, surrounded by his papers and the additional documents from Loretta, Aloan finally saw the complete picture emerging. Project Lazarus wasn't just corporate espionage. It was systematic destruction disguised as legitimate business. Mercer Wellington had orchestrated the downfall of both Westbrook and Blackwood, positioning himself to acquire the remnants at pennies on the dollar. The man was a vulture dressed in Armani. She checked her phone, still no signal this far up the mountain. The isolation had seemed perfect when she'd arrived 3 days ago, but now she felt uneasy. The flash drive contained explosive evidence, falsified documents in Mercer's handwriting, recorded conversations, bank transfers that created a damning trail. A vehicle engine rumbled outside. Through the window, she glimpsed Mercer's Range Rover pulling up the gravel drive. Her heart raced as she gathered the critical documents into her backpack. How had he found her? The door crashed open before she could escape. Breaking and entering is a crime, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Mercer stepped inside, snowflakes melting on his cashmere coat. As is corporate espionage. Your father taught you well. He taught me to recognize the truth. Something you wouldn't understand. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I understand the value of information, and you've been quite busy collecting it. He gestured to the papers scattered across the cabin. Did your little chat with Loretta prove illuminating? Aloan's blood went cold. You've been watching me. I've been watching you since before you set foot in Westbrook's house. He moved closer. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, but you're just scratching the surface. I know enough to destroy you. Do you? He laughed, the sound echoing in the small cabin. You have theories and fragments. I have decades of influence and enough blackmail material to ensure my continued success. My father kept records of everything. Your father was a fool who got in over his head. Mercer's expression hardened. Just like you. He lunged for her backpack. They struggled, knocking over a kerosene lamp. Flames erupted instantly, catching the dry wooden floor. Give me the drive, Mercer shouted, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. Eloan twisted free, shoving him away. It's over, Mercer. The evidence is already backed up and shared. Panic flashed across his face. You're bluffing. Smoke filled the cabin as the fire spread with alarming speed. Eloan edged toward the door, clutching the backpack to her chest. We need to get out, she coughed. Mercer blocked her path. Not until I get what I came for. A burning beam crashed between them. Mercer stumbled backward, his sleeve catching fire. He screamed, batting at the flames. Eloan seized the opportunity to escape, bursting through the door into the snowy afternoon. The frigid air burned her smoke-filled lungs as she stumbled down the mountain path, knowing Mercer would follow once he extinguished the flames on his clothing. Behind her, the cabin was rapidly becoming an inferno. Miles away, Thad paced his office, checking his watch for the third time. Mercer was now 2 hours late for their meeting. Uncharacteristically unprofessional for a man obsessed with appearances. His phone rang. Cordelia, did you see the news? She asked without preamble. I've been in meetings all morning. Mercer Wellington's been arrested for securities fraud. It's all over the financial channels. Thad froze. What? Apparently someone sent a wealth of incriminating documents to the SEC, the FBI, and 3 major newspapers simultaneously this morning. They're saying it goes back decades, including the collapse of Dad's company. His heart hammered. Eloan, what about her? I need to find her. Now. Last I heard, she was headed to some family cabin upstate. Didn't say exactly where. Thad's mind raced. The twins. Are they still playing with that tracking app? The one Ellie let them install on her phone for their hide-and-seek games? Probably. I need to get home. Call you later. 20 minutes later, Thad was in the nursery with the twins, watching as Finn proudly showed him how to locate Ellie Bear on the tablet. See? She's in the mountains. Finn pointed to the blinking dot. Thad's blood ran cold when he recognized the location, an isolated area with minimum cell service. If Mercer received those files this morning. He muttered. What, Daddy? Phoebe asked. Nothing, sweetheart. Daddy needs to find Ellie. It's important. Finn looked up solemnly. Because you love her? The question stopped Thad short. He knelt beside his son. I care about her safety. That's what love is, Phoebe said with 4-year-old certainty. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. Stay with Aunt Cordelia. I'll be back soon. The helicopter ride took 30 agonizing minutes. From the air, Thad spotted the column of smoke before he saw the cabin, now fully engulfed in flames. His heart plummeted. Land immediately, he shouted to the pilot. As they descended, he noticed 2 figures in the distance, one pursuing the other through the snow-covered forest. Even from this height, he recognized Eloan's distinctive gait. There, he pointed. Get us down now. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing. Thad leapt out before the skids fully settled, running toward the figures in the distance, praying he wasn't too late. White hospital walls had always unnerved Thad. They reminded him too much of the night he lost Vivian, of sitting alone in a sterile corridor while his world collapsed. Now, 3 days after the mountain rescue, he found himself once again in an uncomfortable chair, waiting. The door to Eloan's room opened. Dr. Patel emerged, clipboard in hand. She's stable, the doctor assured him. The smoke inhalation was moderate, and the wrist fracture is clean. With proper rest, she should make a full recovery. And when can she be discharged? Tomorrow, barring complications. Though she'll need assistance for several weeks while that cast heals. Thad nodded, relief washing through him. The memory of finding her in the snow, Mercer closing in behind her, still haunted him. The rage he'd felt watching Mercer grab her injured wrist, his desperate sprint through knee-deep snow to reach them. It had awakened something primal within him. Only the timely arrival of the state police, alerted by the cabin fire, had prevented him from doing something unforgivable to Mercer Wellington. She's asking for you, Dr. Patel added. Try not to agitate her. Inside the room, Eloan looked smaller than he remembered, her skin pale against the hospital gown. Her eyes widened when he entered. The twins, she said immediately. Are they all right? They're fine. Worried about their Ellie Bear. He approached the bed cautiously. Finn's made you about 50 get-well cards. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I'd like to see them. The cards or the children? Both. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. The FBI has everything, she finally said. All the evidence against Mercer. The fraud, the manipulation, all of it. I know. They interviewed me yesterday. Thad sat in the chair beside her bed. Why didn't you come to me with what you found? Would you have believed me? She looked away. After I betrayed your trust? I don't know, he admitted. But you should have given me the chance. Her fingers plucked at the blanket. I was going to. After the cabin. I just needed to be sure. Sure of what? That I wasn't complicit. That I wasn't wrong about you. Her eyes, when they met his, were clear and direct. Initially, I came to your house believing you destroyed my father. But nothing about you matched the monster from his journals. Thad leaned forward, elbows on his knees. We were all pawns in Mercer's game. Your father, my father, you and me. Loretta, my father's assistant. She said he realized the truth at the end. That's why he... Her voice broke. I know. Thad hesitated, then reached for her uninjured hand. My father never knew. He died believing he'd failed. She turned her hand to grip his. I'm sorry. For everything. So am I. He took a deep breath. I should have listened. I should have asked questions instead of making assumptions. We were both looking for someone to blame. And we both found Mercer. A humorless smile crossed his face. He's facing multiple federal charges. They found offshore accounts, evidence of at least 3 other corporate sabotage operations. He won't see daylight for decades. Eloan closed her eyes briefly. It doesn't bring our fathers back. No, Thad agreed softly. But maybe it gives us a chance to move forward. Her eyes opened, studying him. Forward where? Before he could answer, the door burst open. Cordelia entered, each hand holding a squirming twin. Sorry, she said, not looking sorry at all. They wore me down. Ellie. The twins scrambled from their aunt's grasp, climbing onto the bed despite Thad's protests about being careful. Eloan's face transformed, joy replacing pain as she hugged them with her good arm. I missed you both so much. We missed you infinity, Finn declared solemnly. Are you coming home now? Phoebe asked, snuggling against her side. The question hung in the air. Eloan looked to Thad, uncertainty in her eyes. Actually, he said, that's what I came to discuss. Cordelia raised an eyebrow. Come on, munchkins. Let's give the grown-ups a minute. She extracted the protesting twins, mouthing, good luck, to Thad before closing the door. Alone again, the tension between them shifted into something more electric. The house hasn't been the same without you, Thad said quietly. The twins need you. Just the twins. His lips quirked. Monica misses your organizational skills. Thad. He met her gaze, dropping the facade. I miss you. More than I thought possible. It's been a month. The longest of my life, he admitted. Except for those first months after Vivian. She looked down at their joined hands. I'm still Silas Blackwood's daughter. And I'm still the man who believed the worst of your father for years. He squeezed her fingers gently. Maybe that's our penance. To see beyond the past. To choose something better. Like what? Like coming home. Not as the twins' nanny, but as... He hesitated. As what? She pressed. As whatever we want to be to each other. He brought her hand to his lips. No more masks. No more walls. Tears gathered in her eyes. I'm not sure I remember how to live without them. We'll figure it out together. He stood, leaning over her. If you want to. I want to, she whispered. God help me, I do. His lips met hers, gentle but insistent, a promise rather than a demand. When they broke apart, something had shifted irreversibly between them. Is that a yes? He asked, his voice rough. She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Good, he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. Because the twins have already redecorated your room. According to Finn, it needed more dinosaurs. She laughed through her tears. Of course it did. 6 months later, Eloan stood on the terrace of the Westbrook mansion, watching Thad chase the twins through the sprawling garden. Their laughter carried on the summer breeze, a sound that still occasionally caught her off guard with its simple joy. Penny for your thoughts, Cordelia said, joining her with 2 glasses of lemonade. Just thinking about how much has changed. All for the better. Cordelia clinked her glass against Eloan's. You know, when I recommended you as their nanny. I had no idea you'd end up as my sister-in-law." "He hasn't asked yet," Eloan reminded her, though the platinum emerald-cut diamond on her left hand suggested otherwise. "Please. The ring, the adoption papers for the twins, the foundation you've started in both your father's names." Cordelia smiled. "Face it, you're stuck with us Westbrooks now." Below, Thad had captured Phoebe, spinning her through the air while she shrieked with delight. Finn clung to his leg, demanding his turn. The joy on Thad's face, open, unguarded, made Eloan's heart swell. "I can think of worse fates," she said softly. Later that evening, after the twins were tucked in, a ritual now shared between Eloan and Thad. They sat in the library where so much had begun, where walls had first cracked, where truths had been revealed, where healing had started. "Grant called," Eloan said, curling against Thad's side on the sofa. "The Memorial Scholarship awarded its first grants today." "That's wonderful." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Your father would be proud of what you've built from the ashes." "Our fathers," she corrected gently. "It honors them both." Thad's arm tightened around her. "I have something for you." From his pocket, he produced a small, worn photograph. Eloan recognized it immediately, a younger Silas Blackwood standing beside Thad's father at a technology conference, both smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. "Where did you find this?" "In one of my father's old journals. Before everything fell apart, they were friends." He traced the edge of the photo. "I thought perhaps we could keep it in our bedroom. A reminder of what we lost, of what we found instead." He turned to face her fully. "I spent years letting grief define me, letting anger wall me off from everything good. But you and the twins, you showed me another way." Tears pricked her eyes. "We showed each other." "The twins want to know when you're going to officially become their mother," he said, a smile playing at his lips. "Apparently, fiancé isn't a concept they fully grasp." "And what did you tell them?" "That I'm working on it." His expression grew serious. "Unless you need more time?" Eloan thought of the journey that had brought them here, the pain, the secrets, the gradual dismantling of defenses, the improbable healing that had occurred in this house once filled with shadows. "No more waiting," she said, drawing him closer. "I think we've all waited long enough for our family to be complete." His kiss was tender, reverent, the touch of a man who had learned the true value of what he held. Outside, the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, witnesses to a peace hard-won and precious. In the nursery down the hall, the twins slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that the people they loved most in the world were finally, irrevocably, home.